Welcome back for our fourth component or fourth segment for chapter 5. And we're going to talk about how to make adjustments to GDP in such a way that it helps to refine the process and helps or hopefully provides a better estimate for true productivity or true growth. So what GDP, again, it's a sense of economic well-being of a nation's people. So that's what we're trying to estimate when we're calculating GDP. And if it's supposed to be the estimate of the well-being of a nation's people or the well-being of society, we want to ensure that GDP is as accurate as possible. And one thing that on this particular segment we're going to talk about is the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP. So again, we talked about nominal GDP, and there was the formula. It's household consumption, it's investment, it's government spending, it's net exports, and it's all calculated or estimated using current prices. So, and they give several decent, actually pretty good examples in the book. So when they're trying to calculate or trying to estimate real growth or real productivity, there's always an issue with price, because you could have productivity that's stagnant, and if you're using current prices, you could show a bump up in GDP, and it might not be a real bump up in productivity. And we'll go back to and I'll use Meharry as an example again. So Meharry last year had 20,000 inpatient stays or hospital admissions. We'll pick some number, 20,000. And it was calculated at last year's prices in 2022 prices. So this year, what happens if they're stagnant at that 20,000, they don't have any more hospital admissions than the 20,000, but they had written in the contract with a given health plan that they had a price escalator that was, I don't know, 5%. So they got a 5% bump in the market value of any hospital admission. And so it's going to look like their contribution to GDP improved, because you've gone, even though you're not producing any more inpatient admissions, you've got that bump up in the price, and it looks like your contribution to GDP is going to improve. Because if you start to think about it, when we talked about earlier, and maybe it was in segment 1, when they're calculating GDP, especially nominal GDP, they're taking the production or the quantity of production and consumption in any given year and multiplying it by the price of that quantity and production and consumption by the current price. So you're taking quantities in 2022 and you multiply them by prices in 2022 to get to the nominal GDP. But what we're trying to get to with real GDP is how you take and ensure that we're calculating or estimating true productivity and true production and consumption of goods and services. And it is a true estimator of growth for any given year in any given country. And again, they're trying to take and work out the impact of price. And what they typically do is they'll pick a year. Let's say they picked, I don't know, 2000. So when they start calculating GDP for 2023, they are using the quantities in a quarter of 2023, but rather than using 2023 prices or the current price, they are going back to the average price or the average price level in the base year. And if they pick 2020 as the base year, then that's the price they'll use in the calculation of GDP. So it's taking out the impact of either increases or decreases in the price level. And maybe they don't use 2020, maybe they go back and use 2010, or maybe they go back and use 2000. Whatever that base year is, then they're able to track what they estimate the true production to be without the impact or I don't want to say skewedness, but the impact of price as you go from one current year to the next. And that's really the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. With nominal GDP, you're using the current price. And with real GDP, you're using a price that is pegged or tagged to some kind of a base period, and that takes out the impact of the price level in any given year. So if you think about 2022, and you want to compare 2022 to 2021, we started having issues with inflation in 2022. We're still having inflation issues in 2023, even though it's starting to come down some. But still, you had, 8 or 9%, price level growth, inflation, however you want to look at it, in 2022. And you can see what that would do to the impact on GDP if you weren't using real GDP to try to estimate the true productivity of 2022. So that's why they're tagging it back to a base year, and they're going to pick a base year, and that base year at some point will change to the next one as the BEA, or the Department of Commerce, decides to move things from one year to the next. And then they talk about, in the textbook, they talk about business cycles. And business cycles, they're just inevitable. We're always going to have business cycles. There's going to be ebbs and flows. There's going to be, recessions, and there's going to be expansions, and it's going to oscillate. And it's something that's inevitable, but it doesn't say we can't figure out a way to manage it, or figure a way to estimate it, or try to ensure that when we think a business cycle is getting ready to go from a recession to an expansion, that we can kind of estimate that. And they talk in the textbook about how hard it is to actually quantify the business cycle, and that in some instances, it's a couple of years down the road before they actually see, here's the way the business cycle has been tracking over the last few years, because you've got data that's slow to flow in, and you've got the BEA that's trying to estimate GDP and or real GDP on a quarterly basis. And then you've got Department of Commerce that's estimating it. Maybe they're doing revisions for the last 5 or 6 years in the summer each year. So you've got data points that are slow moving. There's lag times on the data points, but everybody's trying to go through the revisions and trying to get everything as accurate as possible. And the real thing about business cycles, and they talk about it in the book, they say a cycle implies some degree of regularity and predictability. And unfortunately, business cycles are anything but regular or predictable. You've got talking heads on TV, and it doesn't matter which business channel you're looking at. They are, some guys are, some individuals wringing their hands because, oh my God, we're getting ready to go into this recession, and it's going to negatively impact the stock market and the well-being of everybody in the United States. And what's it going to do to 401ks? And, what's it going to do to our savings? And, we've got, this and that. And then you've got the next guy that comes on. He said, oh, don't worry about that. It's not going to be that big of a recession. May not have a recession at all. And if we have one, it's only going to be a quarter or so. And so you've got everybody trying to estimate what that business cycle is going to be and trying to predict the business cycle. And it's extremely difficult. So when you look at expansion, it's a time period when real GDP is going up. And if you look at a recession, it's a time when real GDP is coming down. They talk about the Great Recession of 2007 and 2009, and it was a tough time period for a lot of people in the United States. But they conclude that is the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, and it may have been in 2010, 2011 before they actually figured out that it was the Great Recession of 2007 and 2009. Now they're talking about the COVID-19 recession of 2020, and it may be, we're probably starting in 2023 to get a pretty good handle on what the impact of that recession was, or that downturn was, and it'll give you a fairly decent idea of what that business cycle is going to look like. And they talk about in the business cycle how they track it, and the business cycle as you're coming up to you're coming up through an expansion, and it reaches its peak, and that is the peak of that business cycle. It starts its downturn, or it hits that inflection point, and it starts the downturn, and it starts coming down through a recession, and it hits the bottom of the recession, and that's considered the trough of the business cycle, or the bottom, and then it starts back up, and it starts back up as an expansion, then it hits that peak, and then what happens when it hits that peak? It starts going down again in a recession. So the business cycle is measured from peak to peak. So you go through and you can look at the example they gave you in the textbook, and that's the way they're estimating those business cycles. They're almost like technical analysis in the stock market. You're plotting data points, and you're finding that those two peaks, and that gives you the start of a business cycle and the end of the business cycle. They have a little quote, and I'm going to read this to you. And I don't remember who actually made the quote, but it's making fun of me and every other economist. But it says, an economist is an expert who will know tomorrow why the things they predicted yesterday didn't happen today. And that's true. Economists like to be experts, and we all like to think that we're at least proficient to some degree at predicting future prices and predicting expansions and recessions. But at the end of the day, we're not that good. And part of the data we're reading in has flaws in it. There's lags in the data, especially lags in the way we're making the estimates. So it's just extremely difficult for any economist. It's difficult for the BEA, Department of Commerce, to predict these cycles, especially the business cycles. And again, GDP or real GDP, whichever one you want to use, either nominal or real, it may not be perfect, but it's the best we have when it comes to estimating the positive or negative impact to society and the individuals or the population within a given nation. And then we talk about business, cycle impacts. And it's more than just, as the book talks about, it's more than just tracking a curve. It's more than, here's the peak, and here's the trough, and here's the next peak, and saying, okay, during this time period, it's a business cycle. Because as you're going through the business cycle, so you've hit the peak, you start down through the recession, maybe impacts on consumers' income, people may be losing jobs, housing market may go down, and if you're forced to sell your house or your home, it's going to be tough, and then it starts back up, and you hit the trough, and you start back up toward the next peak, and there may be more jobs open on the market, incomes may improve, housing market may go up. So tracking that business cycle, it's important because it impacts all of us on a daily basis, whether we're buying necessities for ourselves and our families, or just society as a whole. The business cycle is always impacting us. And it's when you're looking at a business cycle, it's basically a story of success and failure. Success in the expansion, we're doing really well and we're going up toward the peak, and then wheels start to fall off, and we're coming down through the recession, and there's where it kind of falls into failure. Recessions impact the financial well-being and the social fiber of society. And that's what we're trying to estimate with GDP, is how are we impacting that social, fiber of our society. And then, as they talk about, as I talked about earlier, business cycles are inevitable. It's something we have to deal with. And at the end of the day, what a lot of economists are doing and what policymakers are trying to do as they're estimating GDP is they're trying to mitigate these huge swings when it comes to the business cycles, and developing policy, making government purchases, anything we can do to kind of help mitigate this. It's similar to when we talked about in chapter 4, I think it was, when we were talking about the price floors with agricultural commodities. Governments are using price floors to try to smooth out the revenue stream, or try to smooth out that income stream that it couldn't be extremely volatile for the farming industry because of weather and infestations and issues with crop diseases. So trying to smooth that out, and that's what the government would like to do, is try to smooth out these business cycles. They know they're going to occur, but you try to smooth them out and not have the huge wild swings, because that is definitely a negative impact, these wild swings to the fiber of our society here in the United States or any other country around the world. With that in mind, we're going to stop with this component, and we're going to take up in the next component, we're going to talk about the actual measurement issues. I've referred to them some in the past, that GDP is not perfect, and there are some measurement issues, and we're going to kind of get into some of those measurement issues. But I think at the end of the day, everybody tends to agree that GDP is as good as we can get at this point in time. So we'll end up here, and I hope to see everybody soon. Thank you.